What's up, it's the Coaster Craze, and I'm here today to start my new series of quick video essays, Coaster Manufacturers Now and Beyond, where we look at different coaster manufacturers, each one gets its own video, and we discuss where it's at in the industry now, and my predictions for its future in the next 10 years and beyond, the steps I think it needs to take to gain more prominence, to stay alive, because it's a pretty volatile industry. We've seen so many big manufacturers rise out and become huge, and then of course crash, hit bankruptcy, and fall out. Think about Aerodynamics, Togo, Schwarzkopf, etc. We've seen a lot of new ones spring up in the last 15, 20 years. And so I think it's an interesting topic to discuss because even though the pandemic definitely dampened things a bit, I feel like we're in a bit of a new coaster wars. So of course, I'm going to talk today about Rocky Mountain Construction, RMC, which is based in Idaho, United States. I think it's arguably the biggest manufacturer in the world right now, even though it only started in 2001 and didn't even start making roller coasters until 2011 with New Texas Giant at Six Flags Over Texas. And in the past 10 years, they've just become massive. They really started with a bang. They haven't made a bad coaster yet. They've made 19 that are currently operating. 3 new ones are expected to open in 2021 with another in a couple years or somewhere around the line. And I'm sure there's going to be a ton more in this next decade. Right now, their models are the iBox track, which is the one that started all off. It's steel track that they put on top of a wooden structure. Usually it's for old wooden coasters getting new tracks. Sometimes it's ground up like with Zadra and Energylandia. There's also the topper track, which is a wooden coaster track with a couple steel plates on top essentially. And so it's still technically a wooden coaster, but it can deliver different types of elements, like lots of inversions, like we've seen on Outlaw Run, and launch, like on Lightning Rod, even though now the launch is no longer a topper track, it's iBox. And then the other one is Raptor, which is a single rail model, which we've seen at a few parks now. And then there's also another one that's announced, which is the T-Rex track, which is a larger scale single rail. It's 2 across instead of 1 across, higher capacity, bigger rides, but we haven't seen any announced nor built yet. So my thesis for this video is essentially that RMC lacks a lot of diversity in their products, and if they want to stay as relevant and just massive in the industry as they are now, even just 10 years down the line, they really need to diversify their products, introduce new models and track types, etc., which I'll be talking about in this video. So just to start it off, I want to go through their model for how they sell and produce rides and sell them to different parks. So I consider them a bit of the opposite as B&M. B&M has always been basically, we're going to make really expensive coasters that are high quality, and we're going to make them pretty diverse. We're going to have, flying ones, floorless, dive, hyper, giga, wing, and a bunch of other models still. And so parks can get as many as like 5 or even more of them. There's 5 at Great Venture, and there's a lot of parks with 4 B&Ms, but they can only be sold to the very big parks. I think that's proven a problem. I'm gonna do a quick plug to a previous series of video essays, which is right here. I always forget that the iCard is on this side, not this side. And yeah, I did a 3-parter where basically I discussed B&M's history and their future in a similar way to this, so I won't be discussing B&M in this series of video essays because I already discussed them, so I definitely recommend you checking that out. I did it with my friend Blake. It was a really great discussion, great time, a lot of insight. Anyway, so RMC basically is they don't have a ton of variety between the different models. I talked about the 4 models, including the T-Rex, and essentially they're all very thrilling, pretty intense, high speed, airtime, and inversion-based rides. Ejector airtime, snappy inversions, great drops. They're amazing. They're the best coasters, basically. I think most people agree on that. I mean, Wicked Cyclone, that's my favorite RMC that I've been on. Amazing coaster. Every enthusiast loves them. The GP love them as well. And when you're making great coasters, you are going to stay relevant for a while, even if you're not really changing things around that much. And coaster enthusiasts have started to take note of that. There's a bit of an RMC formula. They definitely introduce new elements or change things a bit for different rides, but you kind of know what you're going to get. It's not exactly like Intimate, for example, where they just completely reintroduce themselves, like every coaster it feels like, and they just expand their portfolio more and more. So RMC, their coasters, at least some of the smaller ones, are relatively cheap, especially the Raptors. So a lot of parks can get them. But the problem, which is again the opposite of B&M, is that parks can't really double or triple up on RMCs. Obviously, we've seen this with Six Flags Fiesta Texas, the only park with 2 RMCs right now. And they have the iBox Iron Rattler and the Raptor, which is Wonder Woman Golden Lasso Coaster, the original Raptor. And these are different enough, and they definitely look for the GP and just marketing ability very different, right? One is a steel track with a wooden structure. The other is a single rail, which is really rare. So you can market them very differently. And there is the main difference, of course, the Raptors deliver usually a shorter, smaller, but snappier ride. I mean, those things fly across their course. So they definitely do ride decently different. I unfortunately have not had the chance to go on a Raptor, but the type of ride is still very, very similar. And yes, you can market Raptors differently, but the problem presents itself in terms of their other models. So first off, let's talk about the topper track. So this one was their only one coaster model, but as we've seen, it doesn't look like they're probably going to be making them anymore. I mean, it's definitely possible, but I feel like topper tracks will mainly be used as like refurbishment for their own wooden coasters, maybe for other manufacturers' wooden coasters, but it doesn't really seem like they're going for the ground up woodies anymore. It's been since 2016 when Wildfire and Lightning Rod opened that we've seen a new one. They've only made 4 total, those 2 and Goliath and Outlaw Run. And we've seen lots of them become a lot rougher over age, and it just hasn't worked as well as they thought. Of course, the big one is Lightning Rod, and they were trying to do the first ever launch wooden coaster, and that unfortunately kind of failed. Yes, the ride looks amazing, but they had to iBox track like 2/3 of it this year, and now the launch is over iBox track, so it's not even really a launch wooden coaster anymore. So it seems like it's very expensive for these attractions, and not a ton of parks will probably want them. Wooden coasters are already pretty rare, so I don't see any of them, or at least maybe just only a couple in the next 10 years coming. So that gets them down to just the Raptor, the iBox, and the T-Rex, which again, the T-Rex has not been built yet. I will say of the T-Rex, I think that is a great model in terms of super large parks. Again, this is not going to be something that the small parks get, I don't think at least, but very large parks trying to break some type of record. Maybe it's height and speed, maybe it's inversions, maybe it's length, I'm not sure, or just deliver a massive ride. So again, it's a very limited amount of parks, but it's an exciting model where something like Cedar Point or Six Flags Magic Mountain, although they might be getting a Raptor next year, those types of parks will be getting one. And that'll be great for some years, but of course, models that only massive parks can get only last you so long, because it's not like we're seeing every year a bunch of new massive parks open, maybe like 1 per year maximum. And there's only, of course, so many massive parks in the world. And then, of course, there's the Raptor, which is probably their best model in terms of staying alive, because that prototype you can sell to so many small parks. I mean, you're seeing in 2021, Silverwood in Idaho is getting one. They're not a very large park. And then that water park, Wild West World, I believe it's called, in South Dakota, which doesn't even have a roller coaster, is going to be getting an RMC Raptor prototype in the next couple of years. So really almost any park can get one, which is pretty amazing. I mean, it goes from a tiny water park in South Dakota to Six Flags Fiesta Texas. So that is really great. And I could see tons of parks in the world getting these clones and becoming basically like a Batman the Ride or a Vekoma SLC, but even better type clone, which is great. And then if a parks want a custom one, like it's a bit larger of a park like Six Flags Great Adventure with Jersey Devil Coaster, they can get that as well and just pay a little bit extra money. They can make it a bigger ride, and they can make it a smaller ride. And I think the Raptors are super important for parks that don't have an RMC, that couldn't afford an iBox nor a topper track, getting an RMC. And that is huge. But of course, I don't think there's going to be so much opportunity for parks with already an RMC getting a Raptor. Yes, we've seen it with Fiesta Texas. I could see it with another park because yes, it's very marketable in the sense that it looks different enough, but I think that'll kind of run its course. I mean, there's very limited parks with topper track coasters, and there's not a ton with iBox. So that brings me to my discussion on iBox, which I think gets into some tricky waters, because right now that's their main model, I would say, even though they're kind of going more towards the Raptor and potentially T-Rex as well, which I do think the first T-Rex will open up in the next 3 years, at the latest next 5 years. But with the iBox, right? So originally, it was this brilliant way for old wooden coasters that are crappy to become these best coasters, basically, marquee attractions at their respective parks by taking the wooden structure, maybe some of the layout, putting steel track over it, adding new elements to the structure, and really changing things around. New Texas Giant, then they started putting inversions on it with Iron Rattler, Medusa Steel Coaster. Now there's tons of them. You got Twisted Colossus, Wicked Cyclone, my personal favorite, etc. They're absolutely massive, like Steel Vengeance, or they can be pretty small, like Storm Chaser or Twisted Timbers. And the thing with these is, yes, they're not super expensive, especially the smaller ones, but there's only so many parks that have the funds to get an RMC iBox track coaster with a wind coaster that's dilapidated enough or like just not good enough that they would want to change, right? There's going to be a limited amount. I talked in a previous video essay, again, another plug, but definitely one you should check out, about how there's just a decrease in wind coasters every year. The amount that close is far greater than the amount that open. So when there's less wind coasters, there's going to be less that can become RMCs, especially because lots of the wind coasters that are left are like newer ones that parks are not going to want to become RMCs. Like lots of the newer GCIs, gravity groups, RMCs themselves, etc. They're not going to become RMCs. Then there's the classics that will not. Like, think about it. There aren't any classic wind coasters that I would say that have become RMCs. You can make the arguments for maybe a couple, but something like Wild One at Six Flags America, which is my home park, it's like over 100 years old. No way in hell it's becoming an RMC. Nobody wants that to happen. And there's a lot of wind coasters like that, as well as fan favorites that are more modern. So you get to a limited amount that still are able to become RMCs that fit that mold, where they're not super new and fun, they're not super old and classic, but they're kind of just rough, aged poorly. There are parks that are big enough where they could do something with the layout to become an RMC. And then, of course, let's throw in the GCI Titan track, which was just announced, which I think Predator at Darien Lake is going to be getting. And basically, they're just going to be putting the steel track on top of the wind coaster, not changing the layout at all, although the Titan track does have the same capabilities as iBox track, and that they can change the layout, they can add inversions, do all that stuff. So basically, RMC is getting another competitor, probably a cheaper competitor. And this is a competitor that also is offering where they're basically saying, you don't need to change the layout. You can just get steel track on top of it, so it's easy to maintain. It'll last a while. It'll make it a better ride, but you don't need to pay for like new elements and all this stuff that RMC is offering. So you're gonna run out of options relatively fast. But of course, that brings me to the big thing with iBox tracks that I mentioned before with Zadra at Energyland in Poland, is that they're starting to do ground up ones. That was their first, I believe. And I think it's a really great option. Again, it's a lot more expensive in similar cost range to probably like the topper track wind coasters like Outlaw Run. But for bigger parks that want this hybrid experience, it is great. You know, for the parks that don't have a wind coaster or have a wind coaster that they don't want to change, this is an excellent option because RMC needs more ground up coasters besides the Raptors and T-Rexes. So right now, that's basically their main ones. They have the conversions of old wind coasters that it's going to run its course, unfortunately. There's going to be more, as I'm predicting, ground up iBox tracks. There's going to be a ton more Raptors. That's going to be their big model, in my opinion. And there'll probably be some T-Rexes here and there. I'm sure there's going to be a ton of parks in the next like 10 years that are trying to capitalize on getting new single rail records, like longest, fastest, tallest. I mean, that's been happening every year now since the prototype was released, basically. But where else can RMC go? I think they really need to start coming up with new attraction types. And I think that definitely will happen. I mean, let's give RMC some credit. They've only been making coasters for 10 years, and they already have 4 models that they can produce, 3 of which are already in production and have been sold to a bunch of parks. That's really impressive. And I think just with these like current 3 or 4 coaster models, they'll still retain their status as a top 3 manufacturer for roller coasters in the world, even 10 years from now. Maybe they won't be number 1 anymore because let's just say like Intamin and Vekoma and S&S and Premier are getting more and more competitive, and Mach as well. Again, we're in another coaster wars in my opinion, and with B&M and maybe the Surf Coaster, it seems like they're trying to make a resurgence and really fight for their spot. GCIs with the Titan track, Gravity Group is making crazy wind coasters. There's a lot of competition right now with a lot of great manufacturers. But I do have faith that RMC will make at least like 2 to 3 new models in the next decade, just because that's how manufacturers have to work. And there's no indication that they wouldn't do that. I mean, think about it. In the last 10 years, they've come out with like 4 models about. So why won't that be the same in the next 10 years? And I think not only will they, but they have to. If, for example, they did not make any new models, eventually I think it will just be Raptors that they're selling, and even that will eventually dry up, obviously. Again, I don't know how long that'll take for that to happen, which is why the new models are important. So the question is, what new models? Of course, the easiest thing to think about is like new seat types, right? Like inverted coaster, which I would love to see what RMC would do with an inverted coaster. That sounds insane. There's a lot of competition with those right now. Vekoma, B&M, etc. So there's that. But I think the two biggest things aren't with the seating positions or new track types, or of course new elements, although adding new elements on their coasters is super huge. I mean, think about all the other coaster manufacturers like Intamin and Vekoma that have been taking after RMC's new types of elements and putting them on their attractions. But the biggest things are two. First one is launch coasters. We've seen one RMC launch coaster so far, and that was kind of a failure with the lightning rod. Maybe it will be better with the iBox track, and if that shows, that means that more iBox track coasters, especially the ground up ones, should be launch coasters. Because we're also talking about doubling up. Even if two RMCs are very, very similar, one is like, let's say a Raptor, another is a iBox track, and they're pretty similar types of rides, just having one have a launch on it already makes it a completely different type of attraction. Launches versus lift hills can do that. That's a huge distinction. Even if the rest of the ride is kind of similar, it changes the course of it. I mean, launch coasters can also just keep very low to the ground, which is great for those parks that have height restrictions, but get really fast speeds and can deliver a very different ride experience just by the nature of having a launch at the beginning of the ride instead of a lift hill. Plus, we're kind of in a launch roller coaster renaissance right now. I mean, think about all the major manufacturers that are really diving into the launch coasters. Intamin, Vekoma, Premier, SNS, Mach, all those manufacturers. Launch coasters are kind of their biggest thing right now. Lots of the biggest coasters that are opening up are launch coasters, and RMC has got to get into that. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that the Raptors and the T-Rexes are equipped with launch coaster technology if they want to, and I think that's super important because think about Intamin. They're now a competitor for single rail coasters with Big Dipper opening up at Luna Park in Australia later this year, and that's going to be the first launch single rail coaster. So RMC is going to have to compete with that. And I think that's huge, and I think that will happen. They need to introduce launch capabilities and launch coasters for the Raptor, T-Rex, and iBox models. And that'll be super impressive. They don't need to make launch one coasters because obviously that was a bit tough. It would be cool if they could perfect that technology, but just making launch coasters is enough. And the second thing are family coasters. Every park needs a family coaster. Whether it's an older park that's trying to replace one of their old crappy family coasters with a new one, a park that just really lacks a great intermediate or family coaster that's wanting one, or just a new park. Because we're always talking about how there's not very many like major new parks opening up each year. There are a ton of new parks that open up each year, but just lots of them don't really have the funds for a massive new coaster. But every single new park that opens up pretty much is gonna have a family coaster. And I think RMC Raptors are the perfect model to be the steel equivalent of the Gravity Group family wooden coasters. The ones that are great for the whole family. They deliver thrilling and fun elements, fun airtime, but they're not too intense and the kids love them, the adults love them. They're sold to a bunch of parks. They can be cheap, so sold to smaller parks, but they're great and high enough capacity that they can be sold to larger parks as well. And the Raptor is begging for that. I mean, an under 50-foot tall Raptor that has some great little airtime pops, some fun twists and turns, maybe even a couple overbanks, no inversions or anything, no super steep drops, no crazy ejector flying through transitions like the actual Raptors that are currently operating. But this would be so perfect. You could give it to parks that already have an RMC coaster, maybe not ones that have a Raptor already, but you could give it to parks that already have an iBox. You could give it to pretty much any park because parks love family coasters that are super marketable to the whole audience that they're looking for. I mean, yes, massive coasters are great and they can draw on a lot of like teenagers and older, like young adults and stuff like that, and be like just a lot of talk about them. But if you want a coaster that can draw in literally everybody, you get a family coaster. And that's something that almost every manufacturer, besides B&M, because they only made like a couple family inverted coasters, almost every manufacturer capitalizes on that. And that's super huge to them staying popular. Think about Intamin, Vekoma, SNS, Premier. Just every manufacturer makes their own spin on a family coaster except for RMC, and that's gotta change. If they don't follow these big suggestions, I do think they could be in a much worse place even just 10 years down the line. Of course, if they're making the best coasters that are being built every year like they are now, I think they'll have a place in the industry for a very long time. But the place that they have now, I think can definitely be jeopardized because there's so many hungry manufacturers out there that keep on expanding every year. And that's something RMC is going to need to do. But I have faith they will. I'm not trying to warn everybody with this video and be like, oh my gosh, RMC is going to go bankrupt in 10 years. Because that's not going to happen. But I'm just making this video basically to analyze where they're at right now and to show the best steps I think they have to keep at their #1 spot in the industry. So thank you guys so much for watching the first episode of my new series, Coaster Manufacturers Now and Beyond. Make sure to like and subscribe. I hope you enjoyed this video. Comment down below any other manufacturers you'd like to see in future videos of this series. Also stay tuned to my 2021 park plans video coming very soon, as well as a ton of content for my first park of 2021, which will be next week. You should definitely check out the Coaster Craze Instagram, which I'll link in the description below to see updates from the park and what that park is and when I'm going. So thank you guys so much. I'll see you later. This is Coaster Craze signing off. Goodbye.